coming to the table. This time I am honored and happy to have Joseph Martinez here. And Joseph and I met years ago in Singapore. We have had a lot of discussions on negotiations. And I'm thrilled having Joseph here for so many reasons. But one of them is that Joseph is coming with the angle of the buy side in negotiations. So welcome to you, Joseph. Could you just share a few words on who you are and your background?
Certainly, Keld. First off, thank you very much for having me as your guest today. Just by quick way of background, I do have, when I look at my career, I look at it in terms of three areas. The first area, which is really not relevant to the conversation today, was I was in the U.S. Army for many years. Secondarily, I was a consultant with PricewaterhouseCoopers for many years, followed by starting in financial services about 25 years ago. So I have held a variety of senior level positions across the industry on a global basis, and I've been lucky enough to have worked for some of the first tier financial services institutions in both the United States, South America, and in Asia.
And your current role?
I am currently the Chief Procurement Officer for Bank of New York Mellon. In that capacity, I have responsibility for the supply chain and am currently new to the role. And so we're in the process of putting in place a finance operations transformation initiative in order to be able to bring up the level of professionalism and to help to really improve the ROE and the cost-to-income ratio for the bank.
Joseph, being a thought leader within procurement and negotiation, how do you see the difference between the buy and the seller side on negotiation, or do you see a difference there?
Well, there's a significant difference between the buy and sell side, and I think one of the things that we look at from the buy side is that we have to really make sure that we're really understanding and keeping up to speed with markets, and the market intelligence is a crucial component of the buy side strategy. Mm-hmm. So when you're on the sell side, you're really taking a look at a product or a service that you are the subject matter expert in, and you actually understand what that whole total cost structure actually looks like. When you're on the buy side, that's something that is not transparent to you. And so you need to use market intelligence, benchmarking, and you need to find ways to actually say, okay, how am I actually going to derive the most viable financial agreement between the third party and yourself? Right. And so I think part of that really is a difference in preparation. Sure. I think you need to look at it in a multidimensional fashion, so that you're really almost looking at like a 3D chessboard. So you're saying, okay, what are the table stakes relative to the deal? What am I doing outside of the deal in preparation for that? Yeah. And then how do I actually create a strategy that will enable me to kind of pull multiple levers so that I'm able to actually make the pie bigger? Yeah. And then I'm able to actually get to yes in a fashion that is going to be commercially viable for both parties. Because what you don't want to do is to be the person that is forcing a deal that is not profitable for the supply side, because then your service levels are going to fall off, or they're going to switch out the A team for the C team, et cetera.
Sure. Now, the old school, what I would call the old school traditional procurement officer, might have been the person that would lean back behind his desk and tell the sales rep on the other side, give me your best shot, kind of putting the work effort on the other side. How do you see that, what I would call the old school approach? Is that something that had died out and we have a different collaboration today, or what's your view on that?
I think that's a very good question. And when you start to think about it, probably 20, 25 years ago, everybody was into kind of a win-lose scenario, okay? And then we came out with kind of the win-win and getting to yes. But I think we've evolved beyond that. I think what we're doing now is we're really trying to say, okay, how do we actually find the right fit from both an efficiency and an effectiveness perspective relative to the market, relative to the strategies that we have as an organization, and how do we actually then work with the supply base, a smaller supply base, where you can actually have true collaborative partnerships. And with the digitization of most industries, that's going to become even more efficient and effective if you actually plan accordingly, you study the market dynamics, and you're able to structure agreements that have innovation components to them, and that are able to ensure that the individuals that are actually negotiating at the table actually have as much information as they possibly can, and actually do pre-planning prior to getting there. So I think that the old way of showing up and saying, I want to get 10% off or whatever it is, I think those folks are dinosaurs, and we all know what happened to the dinosaurs, don't we?
Sure, yeah, good. Another question, Joseph, I'm thinking about, this might be a hard question or difficult one to answer. Are we actually good at it? Do you see that regardless whether we're sitting on the buying side or the selling side, do we have the necessary competences? Do we have the experience? Do we have the required knowledge? And of course, it's a difficult question because I'm generalizing right now.
Well, if I look at that in general, outside of the business world, the answer to that is I think that we do have a significant degree of competence. And what I mean by that is individuals are negotiating every day, whether they realize that they're active negotiating or not. Take a group of friends that want to go out and meet somewhere, right? There's a negotiation involved. So people are unconsciously negotiating on a regular basis. But just because you know how to be able to coalesce a team to actually go to a particular restaurant doesn't necessarily mean that you have the skill set necessary to be able to put a complex deal together. So I do think that there's an evolutionary component to that, and I do think that if you take a look at where the industry on both the buy and sell side has evolved over the last 20, 25 years, with such organizations like the International Association for Commercial Contract Management, or ICCM, who are really trying to ensure that there is equal training on both the buy and the sell side, those are, I think, helping to kind of raise, a rising tide lifts all ships. And I think that this is something that is really beneficial to both the buy and the sell side. So I do think that we are at different stages of competency, but I do think that the pendulum has moved more towards competence and away from the incompetence and intolerance that we probably saw 25 years ago.
Well, that's good news. Looking into the future, technology. Some people claims that, artificial intelligence will take over 10, 15 years from now, conduct negotiation on behalf of humans, and actually do a better job. What's your viewpoint on that, Joseph?
Well, I think that artificial intelligence does have a place, and I do think that it is starting to evolve. That said, I do think that for certain types of low-level commodities, that may actually be something that does occur. But I think when you get into what I call second-level thinking, you're always going to probably end up at the end with a human being helping to actually get that deal across the line. And when I look at it, I actually think that it's actually going to be more beneficial to the buy side than it is to the sell side. Because what's going to happen is we're going to be able to get much more transparency from a front-to-back perspective relative to the cost components within the deal. And so that's going to enable the buyers to be much more effective in terms of the negotiations that they have. And that's why really kind of looking at this whole notion of collaborative partnerships with your supply bases are going to become even more keen. So I do think it has a place to play. I do think it will help with market intelligence. I do think it will help to shorten the cycle time. But at the end of the day, I still think that humans want to interact with humans.
Now, we have some of our audience that would like to get into procurement and would like to be a negotiator within procurement. What are some of the skills that you would require as an executive within that industry?
Well, from a buy-side perspective, I think it's really important that we actually have individuals that are formally educated within supply chain. There are a variety of really good schools out there that have that. As a matter of fact, Arizona State University is one of the top schools for supply chain in the country. So I do think that foundationally having that basic degree from one of the universities that produces that is important. I do also think that a basic skill that you're going to need is to have somebody who has a high level of integrity, somebody who has a high level of curiosity, somebody who is actually innovative relative to what they're doing in and around the space. And I think what's also going to be important is that you take certain individuals within the broader business, and I do what I call taking mercenaries and making them into patriots. And so if you can bring some of the subject matter experts that are within the business, and you can easily give them the fundamental training necessary to succeed with it within a sourcing or supply chain role, because they now will have a clear appreciation for what's actually happening inside the business, and then you can kind of wrap that skill set around that for them. So I think as you look at different tiers, entry level, you probably want to recruit out of a supply chain school. But when you get to that middle or higher end, because these individuals have already been in business for many years, it probably makes a bit more sense to actually help bring them across and then put them through training programs.
Joseph, you've been working all over the world and have an intensive knowledge about different cultures. And this is a kind of an unfair question, but do you see some cultures are superior in negotiation compared to others?
The answer to that is yes, but I also think that you need to think about the diversity of thought, and you have to take it out of the actual negotiation itself. You know, human beings have been negotiating for at least 20,000 years, okay? And one would almost say that we are a species that has survived due to negotiations. But when you take a look at the way the world has been constructed by the various geographical areas and the philosophies that have grown out of them, I think that that has had a direct impact in the way people will ultimately end up negotiating. So when you think about Asia in general, or what you're thinking about is they've had essentially they view the world in terms of a circle of time, where there are entry points along that continuum. And so when you have that, I think you don't see things in a black and white manner. And then when you think about what we do in the Western world, okay, our idea of time actually came from the Greeks. And so we see time as linear. So you only get one shot to go down the road. And so I think those two different philosophies actually have then transpired into a different approach to actually negotiating.
Right.
So one is, I think, from a Judeo-Christian perspective, things are either a 1 or a 0, they're black or a white. When you get into Eastern cultures, when things are actually circular and time is a circle, what I think you end up with is a different view where things are gray. They're not really black or white. And when those two come together, there could be some difficulty in being able to actually go through and actually negotiate as effectively as one would want to without understanding that cross-cultural connection.
Right.
And so what I think is really important is for you to actually understand and immerse yourself in the culture that you're actually going to be negotiating with, and understand what the norms are. Understand how essentially these people think about life in general, and then use that. In some cultures, you can go in and you can quickly establish rapport. In other cultures, it's going to take months, maybe even years, for you to establish that level of rapport. And so I think it's really important for you to understand what is the historical background of the individual group that you're actually negotiating with.
Right.
And then what you can do is to build your strategies in such a manner to do this. I also think that regardless of culture, it's really important to meet people face to face in real time at least once.
Right.
Okay, outside of having that close personal connection, what happens is it's very difficult, because it comes down to trust. And you have to build trust, and trust is not built through a video screen. We happen to be physically in the same place today. I have the ability to shake your hand, and if I shake your hand, then what that does is that gives us the ability to actually have that connection.
Sure.
So then we can talk on the phone, or we can go out and use other mediums in order to be able to effectively drive a negotiation.
Right.
But I think ultimately culture is critical in understanding that culture to being effective.
It's interesting you're saying that part about the face-to-face meeting. I completely agree, by the way, Joseph, because I meet a lot of organizations that, in order to save costs, reduce the traveling. You know, so we just do an email negotiation, or we just do an online thing, or we meet on Zoom or whatever. So how do we change that behavior, or that understanding that it is required to meet at least once, as you're saying?
Well, I think that each company that an individual works for is going to have a different culture itself. So you need to adapt to what that culture is. And I do think that for lower level tactical type activities, you know, the phone, video conferencing, Skype, etc., those are probably sufficient, okay? But when you go into those multi staged, significantly large negotiations, I do think that you do need to invest in that. And I think that it is an investment on behalf of the organization, because what's going to happen is, in many instances, these are going to be multi-year, very complex initiatives where individuals are going to be facing off on a regular basis. So it's got to be broader than just the individuals that are at the table negotiating. It may make some sense to bring your operations people in, to bring some of your front office people in, to bring some of your technology people in, so that they have that ability. Is it more costly? The answer to that is no. On the front end, yes. But over the life of the contract or the agreement, you're actually going to get the dividends in spades. And I think it's important that when you have multi-parties to a specific initiative, that it's even more crucial that they meet, because you're going to end up having to put what are called OLAs between the different groups and the different parties, and so without actually meeting and creating that subculture around a complex initiative, I think that you'll actually have your costs rise over time versus reduce over time if you actually have people that know each other, can trust each other, and have the ability to work more effectively.
Interesting. Talking about trust, you just mentioned that a few minutes ago. As you might know, trust is one of my key issues within negotiations. And a lot of studies shows that trust has declined in the Western world, specifically in the last 20 years. Back to my question about different cultures and areas in the world. Do you see that we have different trust levels around the world as well? Or do you see some groups of people, a culture being more trustworthy than other people?
I do think that we do have significantly different levels of trust in different parts of the world, okay? And I think that comes back to, you have deep-seated historical context in the Middle East as an example. So there's going to be a difference relative to how people view trust with each other based on historical precedent.
Right.
You have other cultures, as an example, the United States, potentially Canada, where they are countries built on immigrants. Okay, and so that has given a better feel where people can actually establish trust, I think, in a more relatively short period of time. Then you have other cultures. I lived and worked for many years in Asia, and in Japan specifically, it's very difficult to build trust in a day. It doesn't work that way.
It takes time.
It takes time, and you need to actually understand the motivation behind the individual and the product or the service that they're offering in order to be able to establish the basis of the relationship. And that may take you 18 months, whereas in America, it may take me 15 minutes. So
that's a huge difference, isn't it?
That's a huge difference.
Right. Is that a problem? Is that an issue for some people coming from the West, that we underestimate the time that is required when we leave the US or perhaps even Europe?
Yeah, I would say that it can be. But again, if you go back, preparation for any negotiations is crucial. If you have the ability to actually prep your negotiating team prior to going and having another cultural experience, I think that will be very beneficial and will pay spades. And I think a lot of corporations today are actually investing in that.
That's good.
So prior to sending anybody to, whether it be India, Japan, whether it be Germany, what they do is they'll give them some sort of context, they'll give them a small class as to what the proper business etiquette is within those particular areas. And that helps. But once you get there, the heavy lifting actually starts. And that's really kind of making sure that one is working effectively with each of their counterparts and understanding their motivations, understanding what the desires are for those business models. And that is going to take time. There's no shortcuts around that.
Sure. Now, as you said, and that's good news, that we have a tendency to be better prepared and focus on preparation, for instance, on the time it requires to gain trust. But on the other hand, is it your experience that the counterpart, thinking of us coming from the West, are the counterpart prepared as well for our view of time? So if you go to Japan, or the Japanese preparing as well, thinking, here comes an American, his view on trust is 15 minutes, and we are thinking about it in 18 months?
Yeah, and I think in that context, in global organizations that may happen to be based out of Japan, they're probably more westernized relative to the way those interactions are going to go. But if you go into one of the prefectures within Japan, into maybe a component supplier, that may still be more of a tendency that you're going to have a longer time to build that trust. But I think in the multinationals today, they've done a terrific job of sending their executives on expat assignments on a global basis. They bring back some of those learnings, and that's helping to reduce that cycle time.
Is there any culture in the world that you have a hard time trusting in general?
Yes, there are some, particularly in Asia, predominantly in some parts of Asia where the cultures are still evolving. They're coming out of a period where they've essentially had to morph with different types of governments. And with different types of socioeconomic backgrounds, and in some instances even caste systems. And so I do think that is an area where you have to take a cautionary approach, but you have to understand that if you are transparent and you work effectively, there should really be no reason why you can't put together a solid a solid agreement with the third party.
Okay. World Economic Forum came up with a study last year claiming that the skill of negotiation is the fifth most important skill, regardless of what job you're holding. Whether it's number 5 or 4 or 6 most important skill, are you surprised that they in their study put negotiation that high on the requirement, regardless of what job you're handling?
I'm not. I actually think that it's probably higher.
Really?
I do, and I would say that, think about this, okay, when you walk into any organization, day one, you're already negotiating. You're negotiating essentially to fit into that culture. You're negotiating in order to be able to actually interact with your peers. In many instances, what's happening is you won't have one single boss when you go into a new organization, maybe on an org chart, but in reality, your stakeholders are also your boss.
Yes.
And so I think that level of negotiation is very much something that is alive and well. And frankly, I think that if you don't negotiate effectively, it's got to be closer to 2 or 3. I really believe it. 5, I think, is a little far down on that. And I think it's, again, are you consciously aware of the negotiations that you're doing? Most people are not. But believe me, inside an organization, without your ability to negotiate effectively for resources, for budget, for training, et cetera, you're going to fail as an organization. And then you take that and you transcend that to your supply base, okay, and to ultimately your customer base, because everything we're doing is ultimately to help your institution make money, give them a better return on their investment, and help them to reduce their cost-income ratio.
Yeah, right. The reason I'm asking is that because sometimes you'll meet, for instance, an engineer, just to mention somebody who's saying, well, I don't really negotiate in my job, it's not part of my job title. What would your answer be if you had an employee who were telling you that?
Well, I would say, when you need to get a new component, if you're an engineer and you're developing a new product, okay, you're going to need to make sure that you have a bill of materials that stands behind your design. And so you're going to need to actually be negotiating with your peers who have other assignments that they're trying to get priority on in terms of what they're doing. You're going to have to work with your procurement organization in order to make sure that you're getting them to understand why you need specific stuff. And this becomes particularly important if there is a single or sole source item that you need. Okay, because the guys in procurement are always going to want to go to the market as quickly as possible. And the guys in engineering sometimes are going to say, guess what, I think that KJ Enterprises is the only one that can actually provide this component to me. Well, is that a single source or a sole source?
Sure.
So there comes a little bit of that negotiation. So I do believe everybody is negotiating on a regular basis. They may not have a commercial component to it, but at the end of the day, that's how things get done with human beings.
Do leaders make better negotiators, Joseph?
Well, that's a tricky question, okay? And the reason I say that is that because oftentimes it's been my experience that individuals that were really good at a particular function got promoted up. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're maintaining that edge and that skill. I think negotiation is something that is a skill, like a muscle that needs to be exercised. Okay, and so if you had somebody who got promoted up 20 years ago, as an example, 10 years ago, if they didn't really have continuous education and they don't have that intellectual curiosity to continue to take a look at new and innovative ways for where negotiation is evolving, I think that they could tend to become laggards. Okay, so it's different managing a team than it is interacting with the third party. And so I do think that some executives do that efficiently, but I think in general, I think you're probably, as you're going up the corporate ladder, you're probably becoming unconsciously incompetent.
Okay, right, interesting. Joseph, what if you think back in your career, what has been a really both interesting and successful negotiation that you participated in?
Well, I've had many of those over many years. I can think of a specific example where we were having a compressed time pressure. So I was working in Asia at the time, and one of our suppliers in Hong Kong came to us and they said specifically, we're actually going to be closing down the data center, which is basically the heart for the bank, in about 8 months. And we know that we're going to be in breach of contract, but but the property is going to be redeveloped, and we want to unlock the value, which is worth billions of euros, versus what you're paying us for this. And so we had to kind of go into a mode where we're saying, okay, how do we actually think this through? Because at the time, it was taking us on average about 18 months to put together a data center. We had 8 months. Okay, and so we had to really start thinking about how do we negotiate and how do we partner and how do we do this as effectively as we can.
Right.
And so that negotiation became a multi-phase. We were negotiating an exit strategy with the incumbent supplier. We were doing a market scan in order to be able to say, where can we actually stand this up quickly enough? And then once we went through that selection process, we partnered with a firm out of Japan to actually set up the data center. And we then had to work with each of the subcontractors to make sure that we could expedite bringing in the equipment, because some of these are very long lead time items, right?
So there was a number of negotiations involved with that.
So it was a very, very complex negotiation in order to bring it together and to put it in place. We were ultimately successful in doing it. We actually went live in about 7.5 months, which then became the new global standard for the bank that I was working for at the time.
That's interesting. So there must have been some tension and some stressful periods during that 7.5 month. Huh?
There clearly was. I think the word expediting became a very critical skill set. And I think also being able to make sure that you're able to maintain the relationship that you're actually getting out of is crucial. As you're starting to ramp up the new relationship with the new third party, and making sure that senior executives understood, look, if we close this down, we close down our ability to make trades. We close down our ability to service our retail clients. If we close this down, well, in such a manner, it will have a negative impact on not only our reputation, but our regulatory environment, and it will also have an impact on our stock. And so there was a lot of pressure around that, a lot of negotiations around that, but we were able to successfully do this. And it comes down to making sure that you have the right level of market intelligence, making sure that you have the right level of partnership with the third party that you're working with, and then being able to actually go in there and understand, where do I need to compromise? Because in order to be able to move things from point A to point B, in some instances it made sense for us to say, okay, how do we actually partner with the third party and let them do some of the sourcing for us so that we can all kind of coalesce, use the leverage more effectively, and ultimately keep in mind that we're trying to improve the stability of the platform and ultimately, hopefully increase the stock price.
Exciting. We have to wrap up, unfortunately, Joseph. We could continue for hours, I'm sure, but if you should leave our viewers with one important advice on the science of negotiation, so just one thing that you could pass on from your many years of success within this field, what would that one advice be?
I think that advice would have to be essentially, you need to be honest in the way you're interacting with your third parties, and you need to prepare. I think preparation is the most critical component of any negotiations. It's what happens before you get to that negotiating table. And so often people are actually not prepared formally for what it is that they're going to encounter when they actually get into that negotiation. So you need to be able to know what your BANA is, your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. You need to be able to understand what issues are true issues, what issues are false flag issues, and what issues are we able to concede on. And so anytime you go through that preparation is critical, because you need a concession strategy, because that concession strategy should be, in essence, giving you additional value from the other side. But you've got to make sure that what you're doing is you're keeping in mind that it needs to be profitable for both sides in order for this thing to work. So preparation, I think, is key.
And the other word you mentioned was honesty.
Honesty. I think you have to have a high level of integrity as an individual, because I think if you are intransparent relative to honesty, it will be people will see through that, and it will be very difficult for you to be effective long term. So,
Joseph, thank you so much for taking the time.
Keld, appreciate it.
I'm thrilled that you were here. Thank you.
Thank you.